Welcome, everybody. Wednesday, March 5th, Ed Policy Hearing. Thanks for being here today, audience members, testifiers. Thanks for whatever you're going to be testifying on today. We're starting with an informational hearing on special education overview provided for by Heidi Nisler, Assistant Superintendent of Specialized Services here in St. Paul, and followed by 4 bills. 2 by Senator Hoffman, 1 by Senator Farnsworth, and 1 by Senator Boldon. So that's the plan for today. So, Ms. Nisler, whenever you're ready, identify yourself for the record and begin.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair Swadzinski, members of the Education Policy Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Heidi Nisler. As was introduced, I am the Assistant Superintendent of Specialized Services for St. Paul Public Schools. I am here today to provide a special education overview. And I also just want to share a little bit of context of who I am sitting in front of you today. So as I shared, I currently work for St. Paul Public Schools. I oversee all special education services for all 68 schools in St. Paul, which is about 6,000 students. And I also oversee all of the education services that are provided to students in hospitals here in St. Paul and care and treatment settings, and also the education that's provided at the Ramsey County Juvenile Detention Facility in downtown St. Paul. I'm relatively new to St. Paul. I've only been here for 2 years. And prior to St. Paul, I worked in several other districts in the metro, but also in greater Minnesota. I've served as a special ed teacher and leader in Shakopee Public Schools. I also served the communities of Becker, Big Lake, Monticello, and St. Michael Albertville, and also Eden Prairie. So while I come to you currently in St. Paul, I do have quite a bit of experience in other districts across the state. And I also spent my childhood on a farm outside of Atwater, Minnesota in Candy, Ojai County, Senate District 16. So I have a lot of familiarity with needs and services and programming across the state. I'm also a parent of 3 children, 2 of whom have disabilities. So I've often sat on the other side of the table when special education services are being discussed for students. Today, the overview is primarily going to focus on state and federal special education requirements. I'm going to share just a little bit about special education finance, and then we'll provide opportunity for questions if any committee members have questions related to special education. There are several laws at the federal level that really govern the provision of special education services to all students in the state of Minnesota and across the nation. The most well-known and most impactful is IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. This law was enacted in 1975 and was reauthorized again in 2004. And one of the most important provisions of this law was the requirement for every student with a disability to receive a FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. In a few slides, I provide a little bit more information on what that includes, but this federal law was transformational for children with disabilities across the entire nation. Another requirement of IDEA is that students have IEPs, Individualized Education Programs, which is a plan based on the individual needs of that student. And there were also funding requirements that were identified in the initial adoption of IDEA. There are 2 additional laws that really connect closely to the provision of special education services and ensuring that all students with disabilities have their needs met within the school system. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act was passed in 1974, and this is an anti-discrimination law that establishes accommodations for students in general education settings. So if a student has a disability for which they need accommodations, but it doesn't rise to the level that they need specialized instruction through an IEP, they could receive accommodations under a 504 plan. There is also an additional law, the Americans with Disabilities Act from 1990, which is a little bit broader even than Section 504. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is another anti-discrimination law that is broader and applies to public and private settings.
Ms. Nisler, do you mind if we ask questions on each
Please,
slide instead
please.
of waiting till the end?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, your enthusiasm is infectious, so thank you for that. Senator May-Quade?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I have a feeling that by the time we get to the end, I'd be like, go back to your first slide. I have a question. I wanted to ask about Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. There are 17 Republican states that are suing to make Section 504 unconstitutional. That was filed in September, so it's not that far along. I guess my question is, if it's ruled unconstitutional, does Minnesota have mirror legislation that would still allow or require schools to have IEPs and general accommodations in schools, or would we need to put something in statute so that we would still have that in Minnesota if it went away federally?
Yeah. Through the chair, Senator May-Quade, there are some provisions that are specific to Minnesota statute. Minnesota has the Minnesota Human Rights Act, if I got the name correct. I'm not an expert in that area, but it does it is an anti-discrimination statute that's specific to Minnesota. What I haven't had the opportunity to do is go through every aspect of that law to determine if there is anything that would be not that isn't reflected, that would have been in the federal law.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's super helpful. The Minnesota Human Rights Act is wonderful, protective, and it's not overly specific, to be kind of frank with you. So, there is a right to not experience discrimination in schools. I don't know how developed case law would be underneath that as it relates to disability, in particular, accommodations that have been like since 1974 in schools. And so that would be, do you know how specific Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is? Is it as general as like not discrimination in schools like we have in the Minnesota Human Rights Act, or is it more in depth?
Through the chair, Senator May-Quade, there has been a lot of case law that has very clearly defined Section 504. There continues to be case law that takes place pretty frequently that really defines how are accommodations defined, because a student who has a 504 plan in a school district right now is still required to receive a FAPE, a free and appropriate public education, but it's based more on accommodations. So a lot of the case law has really been defined through Section 504 and really not as much through the Minnesota Human Rights Act, because the federal law has pretty well dictated what those accommodations need to be to ensure student needs are being met.
Thank you.
Thank you. Continue.
Okay, perfect. All of these special education laws at the federal level are designed to protect the rights of students with disabilities in our school system, and many of them intersect in some ways. So all students in a school are general education students first. If a student has a disability, they may have additional protections and needs to ensure that their needs are being met. There are students with disabilities in our schools who do not need accommodations, and they may not need special education services. So this green represents students with disabilities whose needs are met without any additional accommodations or supports. However, we have students with disabilities who also need accommodations, and so they would be eligible for accommodations under Section 504, and that's where they would have additional protections and rights as a child with a disability. All students who are also eligible for special education services under IDEA are also protected under Section 504. IDEA just provides additional protections, additional rights, and additional services. So every student who receives special education services also has protections under Section 504. As previously shared, and as I'm sure many of you already know, Minnesota also has many statutes and rules specific to the provision of special education services here in the state of Minnesota. When Minnesota is enacting statute or rule, we have to at least meet the bare minimum established by the federal government. We have to at least meet the standards set by IDEA. However, states do have the authority to enact policies that go beyond what those federal requirements are, and those may provide additional services, protections, or additional regulations to ensure that student needs are being met. Minnesota has many statutes that really align with federal law, and some where we are exceeding the standard that is set by the federal government. I've provided links to the common special education statutes and also where the rules are located that govern really what it looks like here in the state of Minnesota. What's really exciting and what I'm incredibly proud of is Minnesota was talking about rights for students with disabilities 20 years before IDEA was passed. Minnesota was one of the very first states to enact laws identifying protections and services for children with disabilities. In 1957, the Minnesota Legislature enacted the Special Instruction for Handicapped Children of School Age. This law wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. If I've read this correctly, the initial aid was $25,000, and it only applied to students who were able to be determined to be trainable. So many students did not have protections under this initial law in Minnesota, but it was a step in identifying services and protections for students with disabilities. When IDEA was passed in 1975, it really expanded to all students with disabilities. And prior to any of these laws in the state or the nation, children with disabilities were rarely receiving an education in public schools. Many were denied access to public education. If they were allowed to be in a public school, they were often segregated in separate settings, did not receive the services that they needed, and many children with disabilities were placed in institutions. So these laws transformed the lives of children with disabilities. The next part of the presentation, I'm just going to provide a bit of an overview of some of the essential components of special education policy here in Minnesota that aligns with what is written in IDEA at the federal level. One of the most important components of special education is the rights that are afforded to parents throughout this process. Anytime a district is wanting to take an action such as proposing an evaluation or wanting to change an IEP, parents are given the opportunity to consent or deny whatever that action is. Parents are afforded an incredible amount of rights, and a district is required to notify parents at least once a year what their procedural safeguards are when it comes to special education. Parents also have the right to seek assistance to navigate disputes or conflict with the district. And so there are dispute resolution supports that are available to parents as well, allowing them to ensure that they are participating in the process and to make sure that their child's needs are met. Another important component of special education law is our child find obligation. The public school is responsible for identifying students who are suspected of having disabilities and who may be in need of specialized services. This also applies to students who are in non-public settings. So if a student is in a private school or is a parent is choosing to homeschool, students in non-public settings also have a right to receive special education services through their public school. For example, here in St. Paul, we have many students that may attend Cretin-Durham Hall. We also have many students whose parents choose to homeschool. school, students in those settings receive special education services through our public school district as well. And we work closely with those non-public schools and with parents to partner to identify students in those school settings who may have disabilities. When a student is suspected of having a disability, the district would work with the parent to propose an initial special education evaluation. This evaluation needs to be comprehensive to look at all areas of need for a student. And if a student meets the eligibility as defined by the state of Minnesota, the student would be able to receive all of the special education services that they need to have their needs met. Minnesota has 13 categories disability areas, and when a student meets one of those categorical disability areas, that's really their ticket into the door of special education, and then the IEP needs to meet all of the needs that are presented through that evaluation. A reevaluation is also required to be conducted every 3 years to get an updated version of how is this student doing? What progress have they made? Are there new areas of need? What are the current strengths? And once a student has qualified for special education services, the reevaluations don't require the student to meet that initial eligibility criteria again. We're really looking at a continuing need. The goal of special education services is for a student to be making progress, and if a student has made progress and might not necessarily meet that initial criteria, they still get to receive special education services to continue to close those gaps. Here are the Minnesota categorical disabilities. These align with what is in the federal IDEA, but also are very specifically designed or defined within the state of Minnesota. The most common categorical disability areas are speech language impairment, specific learning disability, and over the last about 10 years, we've seen an increase in the number of students who qualify under autism spectrum disorder. Right now, there's about 150,000 students in the state of Minnesota who receive special education services. That number has increased from about 110,000 students less than 10 years ago. There's additional requirements for special education. As I've previously shared, a student who is eligible for special education services would have an IEP developed. An IEP is an individualized education program, and it's a plan that outlines what does that student needs, or what does that student need? What are their strengths? What are those educational needs? What services do they need to receive? What accommodations do they need in general education settings? What modifications do they need? This is really the document that outlines what is this programming going to look like to make sure that a student's needs are met in every school setting. The IEP needs to be updated no less than 1 time per year, and it can be updated more. An IEP meeting can take place at any time. If a student is under the age of 3, they would have something slightly different than an IEP. It would be an individualized family service plan. Special ed services can be provided anytime from birth to age 22. We have students who are referred before they're even born if a family has received a medical diagnosis of a condition that's known to hinder development. So there are times that we are setting up services and connecting with families when babies are just a few days old. And for the first few years, for the first 3 years, it's focusing on supporting the family and the natural environment that a young child with a disability may be in. And then when a child turns 3, it transitions to an IEP that will then continue to get updated. And an IEP may be in place until a child's 22nd birthday.
Senator Kunish.
Thank you. So That's kind of mind-blowing to me. I did not know that those services were available from, pre-birth and then almost immediately upon birth with a diagnosis, a gestational diagnosis. So are you saying this is the school district that is providing these services?
Yep.
That's really incredible.
Yeah, through the chair, Senator Kunish, the school district provides services from birth to 21 or to 22. In some states, those birth to 3 services are provided by different state agencies. In the state of Minnesota, those services are provided through the local school district. And we work really closely with families with some really young infants and toddlers to identify what are those developmental needs that we can support through services from the school district.
And then do you collaborate with any other agencies, the county or other programs, or is it specifically the responsibility of the public school district?
Through the chair, Senator Kunish, we work very closely with a wide variety of organizations and medical providers for some of our really young learners that are 1, 2, 3 years old, but also for high school age students or students that are 20 or 21 years old. We are often working with county case management. We are working with medical providers. We have many students who receive outside therapy, whether that is occupational therapy, speech therapy, mental health services. A student who is older may receive services through vocational rehabilitation services. So our service providers really work hard to collaborate with other agencies and supports that are being provided to students and families.
Thank you.
Senator May Quaid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going back to try to, I wrote down the numbers that you put on the categorical disabilities, and it was 150,000 students currently, 110 less than 10 years ago. I'm wondering if, I know that we made our shift in statute in like 2005, I think, maybe 2006, taking out the R word and putting in more specific. Have we continued to refine those categorical things, or are there, like, is this list of 13 the same today as it was 10 years ago, or is it different? I'm just trying to make sure our numbers and terminology is identical.
Through the chair, Senator May Quaid, these have been pretty consistent over time. There may be slight changes in what the criteria entails. For example, a specific learning disability is a categorical disability where there's a pretty significant change that is in process regarding how a student may qualify for specific learning disability. In last year's legislative session, there was language passed that is requiring districts to change from our current process, which is most districts administering an IQ test and an achievement test and looking for a severe discrepancy. So moving away from that form of eligibility into more of an MTSS, multi-tiered systems of supports, in which a school district needs to provide intensive interventions in a specific area. And we're looking to see if a student is making reasonable progress with those intensive interventions. And if they are not making reasonable progress, then that's where we would suspect that they may have a specific learning disability. So while the category and the name may stay the same, what that definition and the eligibility requirement entails can change through time. Okay. The next provision of special education policy is one that I've mentioned, which is free and appropriate public education. This is one of the most important provisions in special education law, and it's one where there has been a lot of case law over the last 40 years, really trying to define what does it mean when we're saying appropriate. Free is easy. Free means at no cost to parents. So regardless of how much service a student receives or what those services are, it is always at no cost to parent. However, appropriate's a little bit harder to define, and what that really has been defined at as recently as a Supreme Court case in 2017 is that the IEP and the services and what the school district is providing to a student needs to be reasonably calculated for that individual student to make progress in light of their individual circumstances. So it's really reflecting that each student has really different needs, but the IEP and the services need to be designed for a student to be making reasonable progress. When we're talking about IEPs, the IEP team is critical. The IEP team is what makes a decision about a student. So when I am in my office in St. Paul, which is about 2 miles from here, I am alone, am not the decision maker for individual students within my district. Those decisions for a student are made by an IEP team, and it's very intentional that I listed parents first. Parents are a critical member of an IEP team, and regardless of what an IEP team decides, a parent then has the opportunity to agree or disagree with whatever is proposed. The IEP team also includes general education teachers, special education teachers, a district representative, an individual to interpret the results of the evaluation, which really just means somebody who understands the disability that the student has. Once a student is 14 years old, they are invited to their own IEP meeting to really be able to start to determine what is it that they want after they are done with high school. And others with knowledge of the student are also invited to be part of the IEP team too. At times, that may be a related service provider. So if a student is receiving occupational therapy, the occupational therapist would attend the IEP meeting. Parents are also welcomed and encouraged to invite others that they would like to have attend their child's IEP meeting. It may be an advocate from PACER. It could be an attorney that they are working with to navigate a situation that may be really difficult, but the core members of the IEP team are what I listed here, and there's always opportunity to invite more people. Another really important provision of special education law is the principle of least restrictive environment. And what this really means is that a student with a disability has a right to be educated with peers without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate based on their individual needs. Every school district is required to provide a continuum of services for every single student. And what a student needs is very individualized, and what is considered less restrictive for one student may not be what would be considered less restrictive for a different student. What I've identified here are what we commonly refer to as federal settings, and this is just a number that corresponds to how much of a student's school day they are with peers without disabilities in a general education setting. So a student who is in a setting 1 or has an IEP that says setting 1, they spend most of their day in a general education setting. They might be receiving some services and accommodations in that setting, but they are with their peers without disabilities for a majority of the day. Students with a setting 2 might spend a little bit more time receiving special ed services in a resource room or a special education setting, but still spend quite a bit of their day in a special education or a general education setting. When we get to setting 3 and 4, those are settings for students that have a higher level of need and need more intensive services. When we are talking about a setting 4 program, that would be a separate school that only supports students who receive special education services, who, in order to have their needs met, need a very small, structured, supportive setting. Across the state of Minnesota, most districts form an education district or a service cooperative or an intermediate district to provide setting 4 programming, because it is a smaller percentage of students and it's more efficient for districts to work together to provide that level of service. Some of the larger districts like St. Paul, Minneapolis, Anoka Hennepin, Rosemont, Apple Valley, Egan, and several others throughout the state, they are large enough to have their own setting 4 programs. In in St. Paul, I have 4 Setting 4 programs. If you ever want to visit one, I'd be happy to do a tour. But if you've heard of cooperatives, education districts, intermediate districts, it's primarily a function of that organization would be the Setting 4 programs, which are specialized schools. So for the next part is one of my favorite topics, special education finance. I know this is not the finance committee, but just going to share a few points about special education finance because all of the policies, all of the requirements come with costs for districts. And regardless of what the cost is, a school district is required to provide the services that a student needs, and decisions should not and are not made based solely on cost. A student has a right to have their needs met, so just providing a little bit of background and context regarding some of the funding sources for special education services. Most of our funding comes from the state of Minnesota, but there is also some federal funding that school districts receive. Minnesota's special education funding is based on a prior year reimbursement model. So for example, expenses that a district incurred during the 23-24 school year, so last year, a school district would receive special ed aid this current school year. And state special education aid covers about 75% of the initial cost that was incurred. And since it's 75%, that does mean that there is a percentage of the cost that is not covered by special education aid, and districts then use general education funds to cover those costs. If you've heard of the special education cross-subsidy, that is the costs that are not covered by special education funding, but that a district has to incur to ensure that student needs are met. Every year, the Minnesota Department of Education prepares a report to the legislature. It's a very exciting read. So when the session is done, I'm sure that I think it typically comes out in June. And so the last completed fiscal year in which there was a report to the legislature was for the 23-24 school year, which was provided last June of 2024. As of last summer, for the 22-23 school year, the special education cross-subsidy in the state of Minnesota was $726 million. Additional funding for special education services has been provided by the Minnesota Legislature in the most recent school years. So I've identified a few some numbers down at the bottom. Prior to fiscal year 23, so the 22-23 school year, there's a section of the Minnesota special ed funding formula in which costs were funded only at about 6%, and due to changes in statute, additional funding started to be provided in the 23-24 school year, and then starting in the 26-27 school year, there's an additional step up. There's also federal special education funding that is allocated from the federal level. When IDEA was initially adopted, what the legislation included was a statement saying that 40% of special education costs were going to be covered by the federal government. In the state of Minnesota, the federal funding we receive typically covers about 6 to 8% of the special education costs for a school district. In 2023, the Minnesota federal funding that districts received was about $203 million. I've also included a link to the federal allocations by state. If you were to open this up, you would see that Minnesota, in general, receives less per pupil special education funding than most other states, just based on how the formula has been calculated at the federal level. On the next page, I included a little bit of a graph. This was taken from the report to the legislature. So down at the bottom, the dashed line is the percent of special education costs that are covered by federal funding. The last couple of years, it has just been, the federal funding has just maintained, but because costs have been going up, it's a smaller percentage. But what you can really see is the solid line is state special education funding. The state of Minnesota has made great strides in increasing special education funding, which allows districts to make sure that student needs are being met with funding that is specific to the programs that we are required to provide. The final funding component that I wanted to mention was third-party billing. In the state of Minnesota, there is statute that requires school districts to seek reimbursement from insurers and other third parties for the cost of services that are medical in nature. So for example, if a student receives occupational therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy, needs support from a paraprofessional that would fall under a personal care attendant, districts are required to seek reimbursement from medical assistance, which is the state program for Medicaid. One change that was within the last couple of years was the Minnesota Legislature was an amazing partner in expanding the services for which a school district could seek reimbursement, which includes the mental health services for students. So as of October 15th of 2024, more school districts are able to seek reimbursement for school social work services to students. What's important to know is all of these services are services that a student would have already received, but through third-party billing, through MA billing, districts are able to receive funding to offset the costs of special education. Again, during the last completed fiscal year, the statewide special education revenue specific to third-party billing was over $69 million. So this is a significant source of funding for school districts to ensure that the services that every student needs is able to be provided. Okay, that's the end.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Very informative. I can see the teacher in you through this. I have three questions, but members, any questions before or comments or? Okay. Three questions. One, maybe this is something for another day, but it doesn't matter, the slide. I should have asked them when you were on these slides, like my two colleagues did, and we do have a couple senators on remote, so we're going to keep an eye on for if they have questions. But the state and federal regulations, do you know, and maybe this is something you can get back to us later, if some of the state requirements that go above and beyond the federal requirements that are resulting in maybe undue burdens upon special ed teachers, and parents and special ed teachers just kind of shrug their shoulders. I don't know why we're doing that. I would find that answer to that so helpful if it could reduce paperwork for our special ed teachers, and if the parents feel it's redundant. Second comment, I noticed this book that is in this slide. It starts in the 1840s.
Yes.
So, almost 20 years before we became a state, we were already providing special ed somewhere in the state of Minnesota. So that just brought a smile to my face. On one of the slides, you mentioned that parents have the right to deny, or maybe that's not the right word, the right to not receive special ed treatment for their son or daughter. What are like the number 1 and 2 reasons given by parents that they do not want to receive special education?
Yeah, Chair Sonsinski, those are really great comments and questions. I can certainly circle back with some examples of statute that is specific to Minnesota that may exceed federal regulations. But what I want to acknowledge is important work has been happening the last couple of years to look at areas in which there could be further alignment with the federal requirements that still hold intact the services that a student receives, hold intact what the parent rights are, but may create more efficiencies in the system. There is a couple bills later today that touch on some of that alignment, but I can certainly circle back. The book that you mentioned was written by a University of Minnesota professor. In the slide deck, I did include a link, and it like, as you shared, that there were young children with disabilities who were receiving some sort of instruction going back to the mid-1800s, but there was no formal law enacted until over 100 years later. But I think we should be very proud to be in a state that for almost 200 years has been providing some services to children. And in regards to why a parent may choose not to receive services, perhaps one of the more common that I have seen is that a parent has a right to homeschool their child. There are some parents who also choose perhaps more of an intensive medical-based service that may be a full day year-round. So there are times that a parent may decline special education services because they may not feel that those services are what their child needs if they are homeschooling, or if they have chosen for their child an intensive service or therapy for which they want their child to be attending that full time. At any time, we are able to have a conversation with parents about if a child may need services in the future, but those are two situations that I have encountered.
And one more question, you gave the numbers. We've gone from 110,000 to 150,000 students with special needs in the last 10 years. Any thoughts on what you attribute that increase to?
Chair Sanzowski, that's a really big question, and some of it is better identification of children as being suspected of having disabilities, and a big part of that is our really young learners, that we work really hard to partner with medical providers, the county, daycare providers for some of our really young children in our community who may need services. So it's been very intentional with the state through different partnerships to identify students at a much younger age. And we've been working really hard within our school system to increase our identification of students. We have seen since the start of the pandemic in 2020, we do have students that are now presenting as though they have disabilities that at times, had the pandemic not happened, it'd be interesting to hypothesize with typical early childhood experiences, intensive instruction, how would they be presenting in schools now? I don't know that we'll ever know the answer to that, but we've been very diligent within our school systems of ensuring that if a student may possibly need special education services, we provide interventions to hopefully meet their needs before referral to special education, but we also really take the responsibility seriously to be identifying students who may be in need of special education services.
Senator Abler.
Well, just to add on to your comment about the paperwork, one of my colleagues in the great north part of town, Jerry Newton, both Rep and Senator Jerry Newton, spent a lot of time and a lot of frustration trying to tackle the special ed paperwork thing. And so as the corollary to what you could get rid of, or like what does nobody read? So the parents are often the big barrier, and different organizations that are helping students be safe and get successful. But they may actually be counterproductive in their good intentions. And so I have no way to track what that might be, but there's all these reports, and the special ed teachers, they spend all night doing some of these chartings and commenting on stuff. And so the question you might want to ask as you look into this in a position to change something is, what actually has merit? Like what's used compared to what's completed? And will actually change the direction of the intervention for the child. So in a practical way, because it's just besieging these people. I just talked to my teachers last night. They had a thing up in Anoka or Coon Rapids, and I mean, they're dying on special ed, just paperwork in general, and nobody wants to do it anymore. We need more and more. So just to encourage you along the way, Mr. Chair. Thank you. And maybe if you want to testify, I wanted to comment about that. Like, what's it all for, and where does it go anyway, and all that?
Yeah. Through the chair, Senator Abler, I appreciate that comment, that question, because I want to acknowledge it is extremely challenging to be a special education teacher, and it's a very heavy responsibility to be responsible for the legal documentation that is required for special education. When we're talking about an evaluation and an IEP, this is a legally binding document. It's an agreement between the district and the parent. We've been working closely with other organizations, including some parent advocacy organizations, Education Minnesota. A few years ago, we had a meeting where we could where we started to talk through what may be some areas where we can come together to identify what could be some changes. One thing that we did talk about was that sometimes it's not just what's written in Minnesota statute or what those legal requirements are. It's what's required by people like me in my position, the procedures that are put into place at the district level that really take what's written in law and operationalize that for our special education teachers. So there definitely are there's language in statute, there are requirements, but we have been working hard as special education leaders and districts to identify what might be some changes in procedure. And a lot of what these requirements are is just checking all the boxes to make sure that we are meeting every requirement for special education, and it gets increasingly complex because while today's presentation focused on the policy, on statute and regulations, there's also decades of case law that often it's through the case law that there's additional procedural requirements that could get put into place just to be those checks and balances to make sure that student rights are being adhered to. And what I try to be mindful of as well is a lot of these laws, whether it's written law or statute or federal law or case law, exist because at some point a student's needs weren't being met and a parent had to work really, really hard to ensure their child's needs were met in a way that they hadn't previously been met in the school system.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really want to thank you for that explanation to kind of bring us out of this like black and white thinking or, you know, it's just this thing or it's just that thing. Because the answer you gave, I asked, I did if I was going to fix paperwork, like what would you tell me to do? What law would I change? And she said, I don't know that it's a law. I think it's what we have to do to comply with the law, but that's not what you said. You didn't tell us how to comply with the law, you just told us what the law is. And one of the ideas that she gave me was, like if you go to a doctor's office sometimes, they'll have someone come in and like take notes, right? So the doctor's doing the doctoring, and then somebody's taking the notes, and then it's their job to do the charts, and it's their job to do all those things. And she said if we had a team of people whose job it was to do the evaluations, to do the paperwork, while we provide the education, that would be amazing. And there are people who do love doing that. There's people who love to do the paperwork or the teaching. It's just a lot of times they don't love to do both. And that would be a whole shift and transition. But I appreciate that answer because I think it is a complex thing. And she didn't bring up case law, but that is something I think we should maybe look at as well, because maybe sometimes is there a way to codify case law in a way that makes it clearer for districts how they would comply with an outcome of a court case, instead of leaving it to districts to find out, okay, well, now we have all of these additional things, and then here's how we're going to comply with that in a way that they're kind of having to make up on the fly. That could be useful.
Thank you for coming in
Yes.
and informing us and educating us on this very complicated issue, and keep us posted on paperwork reduction. We're hearing the thousands of teachers, special ed teachers that you're speaking on behalf today. We're hearing you loud and clear that you want less paperwork, so keep us updated on that front, please. Thank you. Yes. Okay, we have 4 bills today. Senator Boldon's 1842 is up next, professional development. When you're ready, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. This bill, Senate File 1842, would require PELSB to adopt rules that would require all licensed teachers who are renewing a teaching license to include 2 hours of professional development training on dyslexia. This would include the effects of dyslexia on the development of foundational reading skills, effective instructional needs for students with dyslexia, and mental and behavioral health comorbidities for students with dyslexia. As we have spent a lot, appropriately, a lot of time and effort and energy in this committee and through this committee on literacy for students, I think it also is important to, in that conversation and in that work, be sure that our teachers who are doing amazing and wonderful work every day have the tools that they need and the resources and training that they need to interact and work with students with dyslexia, which is a learning disability that disrupts how the brain processes written language. This can cause reading and language-related tasks to be harder, but it is treatable. Depending on the source that you look at, anywhere from 7 to 20% of people have dyslexia, and so this is certainly something all teachers, come in contact with their students. And so we have a number of testifiers. I also would draw members' attention to a number of letters that are in your packets, largely from parents, talking about the value that this would bring. I also want to thank Senators Duckworth and Mann for being co-authors on the bill. And with that, Mr. Chair, look forward to discussion and hearing from our testifiers.
Okay, we have 4 testifiers. First up, Karen Sunday, and then Ash Rella. Jasmine Myers. And Jennifer Jackson are our testifiers. So when you come up to the table, identify yourself for the record and make sure you sign in. There should be a sign-up sheet up there, and welcome to the committee.
Chair Wendowski and Senate Education Policy Committee members. My name is Jasmine Myers. I am a Tier 4 special education teacher with 11 years of teaching experience, a master's degree, and a board member of Decoding Dyslexia Minnesota. I strongly support Senate File 1842, which ensures that all licensed teachers in Minnesota receive the essential training on dyslexia. Dyslexia is a neurological condition that affects a student's ability to access printed language, a skill critical for every subject and daily life. Without proper support, these students face lifelong challenges in literacy, self-esteem, and academic success. As an emotional behavior disorder teacher, I wasn't initially trained to support students with dyslexia, and by the nature of my K-12 special ed license, I was deemed a service provider for all 13 disability categories. After 8 years in education, I returned to elementary, where a parent advocated for her child's reading needs, which really opened my eyes. At the time, I was the only teacher given the opportunity for a district-funded training. I completed the training in the Sunday system, which is a multi-tiered reading program. I've also completed the Core Learning Online Language and Literacy Academy. It's also known as OLA, which is aligned with the Minnesota READ Act to identify and support struggling readers. I secured a grant for 15 reading dyslexia pens, but I'm just one teacher linked to strong parent advocates, and there are thousands of Minnesota students with dyslexia who deserve trained educators who can meet their needs. The READ Act was a crucial step towards improving literacy, but we cannot fully achieve its goal without equipping all teachers with dyslexia training. Senate File 1842 ensures that every licensed teacher understand the signs of dyslexia and how to support affected students, an essential step towards equity in education. As a former Pellsby Special Education Licensure Reciprocity Group member, I've seen Pellsby's commitment to strong educator preparation. I trust that Pellsby, in collaboration with dyslexia specialists, will make this training both meaningful and accessible to staff and teachers. Students with dyslexia are in every sort of classroom imaginable, and they deserve teachers who can help them succeed. I urge you to support this bill and take the critical step in improving literacy for all Minnesota students. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you for your testimony.
Greeting Chair Swansky and Senate Education Policy Committee members. I am Ash Kutrella, and I am a sophomore at St. Catherine's University in the nursing program. There are many reasons I support the Senate Bill SF 1842 that requires teachers to receive 2 hours of professional development on dyslexia for teacher licensure requirements. The most feared question for many students is, who would like to volunteer to read out loud from the textbook? From a young age, I was constantly asked to read passages. If you asked me after class what I had learned, I couldn't tell you. I was so focused on not missing connecting words, so focused on not skipping lines or rereading the same line again. I simply wanted to avoid the teacher questioning why, as a junior in high school, I was unable to read a simple passage. Reading out loud removes many of the coping skills I used to compensate for my dyslexia. However, none of my teachers understood that. No educator was ever able to effectively explain to me the meanings of terms such as a verb, pronoun, adverb, and many other grammatical concepts. Teachers would take a moment to pause and try to clarify the differences between these concepts and how to find each one in a sentence before giving up a few minutes later and moving on. While I sat there completely frustrated that I just could not get this, I then would have to spend the rest of class battling discouraging thoughts that I am just being dumb and it's all my fault I can't learn such a simple concept. Finally, and most importantly, I struggled to communicate with my teachers what challenges I was facing. I felt like my English failed me when I was trying to advocate for myself. This did not change until I started private dyslexia tutoring. Dyslexia involves more than just simply misreading letters. It's about word processing and it's about self-confidence. Through all of this, if I had educators who truly understood the complexities of dyslexia and not just the stereotypes about it, I would have felt supported. Instead of school just being hoops to jump through, I could have truly learned from it.
Thank you. Next testifier.
Hello, Chair Swedzinski and members of the committee. My name is Jennifer Jackson. I am a parent of a daughter with dyslexia, and I urge you to support Senate File 1842, which would require teachers to receive 2 hours of professional development on dyslexia for teacher licensure. My daughter was diagnosed just before middle school, but despite having an IEP, she continued to struggle because many of her teachers lacked an understanding of dyslexia. She often faced frustration and anxiety when teachers simply wrote out instructions without explaining them. Assuming she could read and comprehend them like her peers, When she asked for clarification, some teachers misunderstood her needs, thinking she wasn't paying attention or was being difficult, when in reality, she was trying her best but lacked the support she needed. She fell further behind because assignments weren't broken down in a way that made sense to her, leading to feelings of failure and discouragement. No child should have to experience this. If teachers were properly trained to recognize and accommodate dyslexic students, struggling readers like my daughter would have a better chance at success. I urge you to pass this legislation so that all children with dyslexia receive the understanding and support they deserve.
Thank you for your testimony. And I'm guessing you're the guy that I missed calling out that's on the agenda, Mr. Logan?
Yes.
Yep, I apologize. I missed you earlier when I read the testifier, so thank you for coming forward.
My pleasure. I've been asked to advise you, Chair Swazinski, that Karen Sunday is abstaining from testifying today. I think she's on your list as well. Anyway, I'm Dr. George Logan. I appear on behalf of the International Dyslexia Association Upper Midwest Branch, where I'm the secretary. I live in St. Louis Park and am a proud constituent of Senator Ron Latz. Earlier, I lived in Roseville, where I learned the importance of a bow tie from Senator John Marty. The International Dyslexia Association Upper Midwest Branch, which I'll call AMBIDA for all of our benefit, the rest of my remarks, is a proud supporter of the Minnesota Dyslexia Coalition. We are a collection of like-minded groups supporting students with dyslexia. Indeed, AMBIDA's national parent organization's motto is, "Until everyone can read." AMBIDA was first incorporated in Minnesota in July of 1973, and we've been supporting students with dyslexia and their families in the state for 52 years. Given that dyslexic students constitute 20% of the population, this is not a rare problem. Members of our coalition have supported legislation in this area since at least 2019. Today, we urge your support of Senate File 1842. The reasons for this are based on the same logic as the requirement that students have periodic vision and hearing screenings. We know that problems in these areas are obstacles to learning, and we know that glasses and hearing aids, when needed, can reduce those barriers. Similarly, the READ Act provides us with screening of students for dyslexia, and this legislation helps with the second part of that approach. It provides information for teachers on dyslexia and will provide them the knowledge that there are interventions for dyslexia to reduce the obstacles it presents. With me today, we have students and also parents of students with dyslexia who have experienced the problems that a lack of teacher knowledge in this area creates. All of us appreciate that knowledge is a powerful thing. Knowledge offers the possibility of changes of teacher attitude and outlook so that students with dyslexia have that possibility recognized. This will go a long way to reduce the risk that they are told by their teachers that they are lazy or stupid when neither is the case. I urge you to support this knowledge for classroom teachers across the state. Thank you for your time and attention and your support of all students with the support of Senate File 1842.
Thank you for your testimony. Members, Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm wondering if Ms. Myers would be willing to come back to the testifying table. I have a question, and it's perfect for a Tier 4 licensed teacher who went through OLA training, actually. Hi. Senator Boldon, I love your bill, and I think I had offered to sign on to it. One of the things we're talking about, I'm the chief author of the READ Act, Ms. Myers. One of the things we're talking about right now as we kind of develop READ Act 2025 is how do we have the continuing expectation for new and future teachers that we have for all licensed teachers now, Tier 1, 2, 3, or 4, and it was to go through training as it relates to the READ Act. And I guess my question would be, in your OLA training, and some others took carry-all or letters, did you find that you learned foundational skills as it relates to students who have dyslexia or have characteristics of dyslexia through that training to teach reading then afterwards?
I'm supposed to put my question towards you, Chair.
In theory, yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
To answer your question, yes, as a case manager and a Tier 4 licensed teacher, whenever now I enter an IEP meeting with the family and my colleagues, I feel more informed about talking about the levels of development when it comes to reading and being able to have more in-depth conversations with related service providers, specifically like speech providers. In the training, there's a lot of talk about different functions of the face when producing certain sounds. And those are things that I wasn't really aware of from my formal training to become an EBD licensed teacher.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Thank you. My one other question is, we are, I don't know if you came in at Tier 4 license or came in through Tier 3 to Tier 4. I'm not sure how, I have the chart of how people get licensed, but I don't never know anyone's pathway. And one of the things that we almost accidentally set up the expectation, like in this bill, we have Tier 1 is going to be taking 2 hours of instructional time. But we kind of set that expectation where everybody took many, many hours. Does it feel like, for a Tier 4 teacher, like if you came from another state and you came in and you would have a Tier 4, but would still have to undergo that training if you hadn't taken it in teacher prep or you hadn't taken some sort of training, would that still feel appropriate to your licensure level, or would it feel inappropriate? I guess maybe a better way to ask that.
Directing my question towards the chair. For a Tier 1 licensed teacher, it's easier if you're out of state to get that Tier 1 license. It's more difficult to get a Tier 4 license if you're an out-of-state teacher coming into Minnesota because of the different categories that we have, and other states don't have those separate categories, the 13 different disability categories. We have licenses that reflect those. So yes, to answer your question, yes, it would be good to continue that training for Tier 1s because they could be like an elementary ed license, not necessarily specific to a disability category. So it would be something that every teacher, because every teacher is going to interact with students with dyslexia, and not all students with dyslexia have an IEP.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that's all the testifiers that were signed up. Sorry again that I missed you going through the list. Thank you. Any members, anybody else? And there's a couple members online. I do want to make sure, if I miss you, scream or yell. Thank you, Senator, for bringing this forward. A couple years ago, we had legislation, and when you renew your license, I believe that there would be a suicidal awareness requirement to renew your license, and I think this is an appropriate another thing that I can't believe when I got my license and throughout all my years of teaching, I never had to learn signs of dyslexia or I just had no idea if a kid had it, and to hear the struggles that those young people had, and so thank you all for those of you that testified about what you were like as a younger person and the struggles. And I can't imagine when that teacher starts calling on students to read the passage, the trauma that you must have went through. So anyways, and final thoughts, Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the testifiers and committee members. I think this is another important piece of the puzzle as we are, building a structure to be sure that every child in Minnesota, has the literacy skills they need to navigate the world. It is a guarantee that every teacher will, interact with some students with dyslexia because it is so prevalent, and so making sure that they have the tools that they need and resources and training to do that appropriately for the best for the students, I think is the right thing to do. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Boldon. And we'll be sending this to state and local gov next, right? Okay. Thank you. Senator May Quaid, would you be willing to move the bill to state and local gov?
So moved.
All those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Thank you. Next up, two Senator Hoffman bills.
I'm going to need another chair, I think, over here.
Maybe we should have this be bigger.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair and members, thank you for hearing Senate File 256. And I gotta just remind a couple of things in your first presentation. I was listening, and the reason why there's just some food of thought for y'all Paperwork is because it's a due process right. This is established in ARC versus Pennsylvania, and then Mills versus DC. You went through that whole piece of it, right? Now, if you want to talk about the precepts behind Public Law 94-142, I'll be more than happy to spend some time doing that presentation to you, Mr. Chair. But remind the group, at the very beginning, the question was asked, Centers for Disease Control and National Institutes of Health said, how much would it cost to educate a child with a disability? Because at the time, most kids were in state institutions. Hence, that's why when you look at 94-142, one of the discerning connections was Brown versus Board of Education when they said separate is not equal, right? They alluded to the ARC versus Pennsylvania that said FAPE is free, but then Mills made it, it's also funding FAPE, right? Fast forward to that, the folks, when they were writing the original language, they said, well, if it's going to cost 40%, the word that was used, Mr. Chair, was up to. They said, we will guarantee up to 40%. They never said actual 40% because they looked at it from a trifecta. You had a local LEA, local education authority, the state and the feds all have an obligation in that. So as you're discerning conversations, especially on paperwork, know that it's a due process right. The reason why kids with disabilities are in school is because of the fact they had to sue for that right? Just think of that. That's why you have that piece in there. And then the other piece was just on the funding side of it. So that's all I'm going to give you right now because really what's in front of you is Senate File 256, Mr. Chair.
Abler.
Oh my God. I know what he's going to ask.
I'm not going to talk about public law at all, so.
94-142, actually it's
I heard that.
CFR 34 300.113 if you want to.
So, Mr. Chair, Senator Hoffman, our colleagues Jerry Newton spent a good deal of time trying to make the world better. Are some of the documents that are created pointless? That's my question. I want to make sure we protect everybody to have every right they need. But it may well be that some of those are not as useful as others, and that's just my query. And can you comment on that briefly, and then we'll let this. But if we're driving people from the profession because they love the students and they love the work, but if we're making them do some work that is extraneous and we lose good people and don't have service, is there some kind of common ground where we could streamline that? In your opinion, just whatever you want to say.
I love that. Mr. Chair, to Senator Abler's point, in my opinion, the answer is yes, but there's a but clause. What ended up happening, and you know this, the local school districts all then were saying, well, we need another piece of paper on top of the paper in order to do this because you got different things, different varying degrees of it. But when it comes to the heart of the matter, the services, supports, supplemental aids, reasonable accommodations, all that stuff needs to be documented because of the fact we're talking about a due process right here, especially when you get into the maintenance of effort. So, Mike Sullivan, do you remember him, Jim? He used to talk about, well, what did the school put on top of the things that we know we need to be doing? And there is a variable degree of differences between that. And so the answer is yes, but don't lose fact of the due process rights that the individual with a disability has. And that was always the discussion we had, you and I, we had 20 years ago on that one. So, Mr. Chair, thank you. Thanks for asking my opinion. It's been a long time since somebody asked my opinion on this. So, 256, I want to introduce the A2 amendment, Mr. Chair and members. It's a compromise to uphold the intent of Senate File 256 that ensures students with disabilities can access their service animals in schools. It was a conversation that my staff, also with the Disability Law Center and with the members, the folks that are behind us, MASA, MESA, all those different acronyms, while addressing concerns about the potential, and I hate this word, special education should never use the word burden. I hate that word. But when you talk about the addressing concerns that school staff might have on that. So the A2, it protects the paraprofessional and school staff. That was a concern. The amendment makes clear the school staff are not responsible for, you see the notation in there. Standardizes the policies for consistencies. You need to have some consistencies, Senator Abler. Preserves the student's independence. The independent amendment presumes the student is the handler. That was the other sticky word that was in there. And then it prevents schools from requiring a third-party handler unless specifically documented in the student's plan. It all comes down to the unique individualized needs of that child and their disability and how it affects their education. That still federal law, and that's what this does. So it gets us in the right direction. I think the amendment strengthens the bill while it ensures it remains practical and workable for schools. And here's the key, it protects the students' rights. That's where I'm at. It aligns with federal law and alleviates the concerns from educators about new responsibilities, Mr. Chair.
Senator Abler, do you want to move the A2 amendment?
I think it's a big improvement, Mr. Chair, and so I appreciate the work that's gone into this and a lot of to make this thing actually work. I'm a co-author and happy to support it. Urge people to vote yes. Thank you.
All those in favor of the A2 author's amendment, say aye. Aye. All those opposed?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Abler. Senate File 256 ensures that students who require service animals cannot be denied access to school. Let me just point this point to you. If a wheelchair is in the extension of a student, which is how you look at this, why isn't the dog in the extension of the student? We're talking about a reasonable accommodation. It's an extension of the individual. Think about that. That's a due process issue. For some students with disabilities, a service animal is essential, not just for mobility, but for independent safety and learning. This bill just clarifies that when a student's educational plan includes a service animal, schools must allow it to. The bill recognizes the unique and individualized needs of every student. That's the emphasis of Public Law 94-142. That's the I in the IEP, right? Think about that. Unique and individualized needs of that child and their disability and how it affects their education. That's still consistent federal law. Ensures the educational equity that no student should face barriers to learn because they need a service animal. The other piece that was about 94-142 was access to the general curriculum. And so the other one is it aligns with federal law. And the ADA already protects the rights to service animals, and this bill ensures that Minnesota schools comply. What it does not do, just so you get clarity on this one, it does not create new responsibilities for schools. The new language specifies that the student is the handler and is responsible for the animal supervision. So today we're joined by Laura McMahon, who drove in from the wonderful city of St. Cloud, Minnesota, and brought her son Ian and their wonderful little working animal. I can't touch him because he's working. That's what it says on the thing. And so with that, I would like them to share what brought them to talk with us about this. And just to let you know, Mr. Chair and members, the bill itself, thank you to Senator Abler, Senator Barr, Senator Cruen, Senator McQuaid. Think about that lineup I just gave you and look about the spectrum of what education should be about. It's what Jim Ramstad said. It should be nonpartisan, should be bipartisan, common sense, pragmatic. Look who's on this bill. Look at those names that are on the bill. Pretty impressive. Over in the other body, it's the same type of makeup as well. So Representative Backer is bringing this bill forward over there in the other body. So, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Testifiers, identify yourself for the record and begin with your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Hoffman. And thank you, Mr. Chair and fellow committee members. My name is Laura McMahon, and I thank you for this opportunity to share my family's experience in getting my son access to his service dog at an elementary school, and what has prompted my pursuit for legislative change. Ian was matched with his autism assist dog, Dewey, from Can-Do Canines in May of 2022, after 4 years on their wait list. At this time, Ian was finishing first grade. Ian's school had been kept up to date on the status of his service dog since joining the school in kindergarten. And finally, the time had come. We were all so excited, including his one-on-one para and teacher. The plan was for Ian to attend school with Dewey in the fall of 2022 with support from his one-on-one para. He likes to go to the ground sometimes. Once school started, and while working out the logistics of Dewey coming to school, Ian began attending school without Dewey, and it did not go well. Ian's behaviors resulted in daily staff reports of increasing self-injurious behavior, most commonly Ian biting himself, and daily pleadings from me excuse me.
You're good.
And daily pleadings from me to please allow Dewey to attend with Ian. At times, Ian would need his clothes changed as they were bloody from his self-injuries. On one occasion, I was notified that Ian attempted to bite himself 50 times in a 1-hour period. Clearly, the support in place at school was not sufficient, and Ian needed help. Due to Ian's disabilities and his type of service dog, Ian needs support with tethering and untethering his belt when needed, for example, to participate in recess, holding Dewey's leash when transitioning around the building, and occasionally issuing commands to Dewey if Ian is dysregulated and unable to do so. At the beginning of the 2022-2023 school year, I was informed that the school's legal team had determined that Ian's para could not support Ian in this way, and that Dewey could only come to school if we provided a separate adult to attend with him. As Ian urgently needed support, I began attending school with Ian so that he could have Dewey. During the 7 months I attended school with Ian, I saw firsthand how staff would try to calm Ian during periods of upset, and it didn't work. Ian would throw items down the hallway, bite things, bite himself, and push people away, often with a lot of loud protests. But once he was allowed to bury his face in Dewey's fur, get some kisses, and play with Dewey's ears for a moment of connection, he was able to get back to work and keep learning. Throughout that school year, the district continuously attempted, for all 7 months, to replace Ian's need for Dewey by any means possible. They tried offering Ian a cat toy, an aversive light-up toy book, a picture of Dewey, a calm-down menu that didn't offer Dewey, and removing Ian from situations where Dewey would be used. Instead of accepting that Ian wanted and needed his service dog, the district wanted to decide whether or not Ian would use his service dog at school. Fortunately, the administrative law judge ordered that support for Ian to access Dewey was necessary for Ian to receive a free and appropriate public education. Results from the administrative hearing showed that no FAPE analysis was ever done, despite me being provided a prior written notice indicating that one had been done. The court determined that school policy was placed ahead of Ian's educational needs. The court found that the support needed to access the service dog was like that of other related services paraprofessionals customarily provide, and the support is less intrusive and less intense than other related services paraprofessionals customarily provide. And yet, the school appealed this decision, and we are still litigating this case through the federal district courts over 2.5 years later. Unfortunately, we have had to spend over $100,000 in attorney fees to reach this point, and it is still not over. This unnecessary situation has placed a great deal of stress on my family. Ian has lost academic, emotional, and functional skills, autonomy, independence, and mental well-being. And sadly, I know we are not alone, as other families have been denied this support for their disabled children as well. Today, Ian and Dewey are doing very well at school, now that he is receiving staff support to access and utilize his service dog. Ian has minimal behaviors and needs minimal and intermittent support to access Dewey. While it has been reported to me many times that Dewey is no problem at all, and staff do not want the support for Ian and Dewey to change, the school's administrators continue to pursue legal action to remove Ian's support for Dewey. This proposed bill establishes an individual's right to make autonomous decisions regarding having supported access to their service dog in an educational setting. The goal of this bill is to readily provide the necessary support children with service dogs may need in an educational setting, in the same manner that support is readily provided for other disability mitigating equipment, such as wheelchairs, or assistive technology such as communication devices. This bill prevents the school from dictating the type of services a disabled person needs in contravention of that person's own decisions regarding their own life and care. Please support this bill so that another family does not have to go through the same turmoil that we have. I welcome any questions or concerns that you may have. Thank you so much for your time.
We'll take questions after we hear from all the testifiers in this, for the sake of time. So we do have 2 other bills to get through. We have 3 other testifiers on this bill. 2 of them are remote, but one is in person. Is Jessica Webster here? And then we'll do the 2 remote testifiers after.
Oh, there she is. Oh. Hey, Jessica.
If we could try to summarize, or, thank you, appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. My name is Jessica Webster. I'm a staff attorney with Legal Aid, here supporting Senate File 256. I want to thank Laura for being such a great advocate for her son, and as always, I want to thank Senator Hoffman for just continuing to nudge our state forward on everything related to children with disabilities and education. I'm grateful for his commitment to FAPE. And just a few notes on service animals. I won't go in depth, but service animals are not new or trendy. They've actually been around since the 1920s. They're trained specifically to support individuals with disabilities. A service animal can be trained to help a student with medication reminders or detecting a medical issue like a seizure. They can detect allergens, perform physical tasks like opening doors, picking up dropped items, be a guide. And supporting a student with a service animal is critical and can help students be independent and participate in school activities. And finally, I'll just note that disability awareness in a school setting really helps with integrating an animal into the environment. The only other substantive comment I wanted to make today, and I promise this is not targeted at Senator Abler, but it's really relevant to the school context. It becomes really easy to ask, what's the bare minimum we have to do for children with disabilities under federal law? What do we have to do around service animals or mobility devices or accessible playgrounds? But it's the wrong question because it leads to close-ended statements of, we don't have to do that. That's more than we have to do, or that's a burden for staff. And I really want us to hold on to this Minnesota ethic and this posture of being a leader and asking not only what do we need to do, but what can we do? What's possible and what's a best practice for children to make sure that they're not only accommodated, but thriving. Thank you for your time.
We have 2 remote speakers, I think. So Jim and Katie and Will, begin your testimony. Identify yourself for the record first.
Hello, I am Katie Christensen. I am mom to Will Christensen. And thank you, Chair, for the time to speak today. I'm a stay-at-home mom to 6 children and the Director for Disability Advocacy at a local nonprofit. SF 256 is crucial because current ADA laws have not kept up with modern disabilities. My son, Will, has profound autism. He's 15. He understands everything that we say to him, but struggles with open-ended questions and reciprocal communication. For example, he cannot give verbal commands to his service dog, Sandy, when he needs her the most. But when asked in a yes-no style, he clearly says, "Yes, Sandy, school." Under the current ADA, service animals must be under the control of a handler, typically the person with a disability or a third party. It clearly states in school, K-12 context, and in similar settings, the school or similar entity may need to provide some assistance to enable a particular student to handle his or her service animal. However, for Will, this isn't possible due to his communication challenges. This became an issue when School District 916 denied Sandy access based on Will's speech disability, claiming they didn't have to provide a handler due to the cost of the para. That was information that I found afterwards. After a year and a half of fighting and consulting with legal experts, we knew the school was in wrong, but lacked the resources for a lengthy legal battle. Those who worked directly with my son freely offered to assist with Sandy in every way. Yet the district has consulted with an attorney instead of giving the choice to the paras themselves. I have reported the district to the Office of Civil Rights, and they have agreed that an investigation into the school district's decision is warranted. I am currently waiting for them to report back to me on their findings. However, thanks to our local senator, Senator Kroon, we managed to transfer Will and Sandy to a new district where they were welcomed and are thriving. His behaviors are now minimal at best. He rarely misses class. which also means he is no longer being denied FAPE and least restrictive environment. Sandy is an integral part of all aspects of my son's life. His success is everything to our entire family. This bill is essential to ensure that my son and others with similar disabilities no longer face discrimination when accessing services or protections. Simply put, Sandy was denied access because of Will's speech disability, and the school district refused to provide a para due to cost. Nobody should ever have to experience the fight that our family and the family sitting in front of you have had to fight. Thank you.
And thank you for your testimony. And last up is Jennifer Danielson.
Oh, wait, I said Jan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senators. My name is Jennifer Danielson, and I am the Assistant Director of Student Services with South St. Paul Public Schools. And I'm here today on behalf of the Minnesota Administrators of Special Education, or MACE. First, I would like to thank Senator Hoffman for meeting with MACE to discuss our initial concerns with Senate File 256. And I would also like to thank Senator Hoffman for the changes he has made so far to the bill. An essential part of my role as a special education administrator is supporting teams in making individualized decisions for students with disabilities. While there are only 13 disability categories for special education eligibility, every student's needs are unique, and there are thousands of ways that those needs present themselves. As a result, Individualized Education Program, or IEP teams, carefully determine the services and support necessary for each student to make progress in light of their unique circumstances. And in some cases, that includes the use of service animals at school. A few years ago, a parent informed a school I was supporting that their child was in the process of receiving a service dog, and they wanted the service dog to come to school with their child. The IEP team, including the parents, began to plan for the dog's integration, including how to educate students, staff, and parents on appropriate interactions with the service dog. Videos and messages were created in collaboration with the family and with the organization training the dog to make sure everyone was aware of the expectations. The IEP team also identified specific skills that the student needed to develop, such as strengthening their arm to throw a ball to the dog, and the student's IEP was amended to address those skills. While planning for the service dog, I was notified that there was a student in the same school who would share a class with this student who was terrified of dogs. So therefore, I worked with that student's IEP team to address those individual needs of that student. As an IEP team for that child, we worked to identify supports, including environmental changes, visual support, social stories, and other things, to support both students. Both students had unique needs related to the service animal being present at school, and each IEP team carefully considered what supports were necessary to allow access to the least restrictive environment for each of those students. In closing, this example is just one small example of how IEP teams make thoughtful, student-centered decisions every day, including the use of service animals at school. We appreciate the opportunity to continue to work with Senator Hoffman, and I want to thank you all for your time, your consideration, and the work you do to support all students in the state of Minnesota.
Thank you for your testimony. Members, with an eye on the clock, any quick questions so we can move on? Senator Abler?
Well, just one. Actually, my comments were about paperwork, not service before. But so is there any, I must have missed the letter that says why a school district would want to sue over not allowing this. Maybe they could bring that forward to us later. Nobody's saying why this is a bad idea. So I don't know why a school district would sue about this. And so to the families, I just don't get that. So I'd happy to be enlightened about that later, Mr. Chair.
Say it goes above and beyond.
So Senator Hoffman, any final comments before we lay this bill over for possible inclusion in the omnibus bill?
You mean you won't send it directly to the floor, Mr. Chair? Come on. Really? All right. Thank you for laying it over.
Thank you, Senator
Appreciate you,
Hoffman.
Mr. Chair and members. Thank you. Thank you.
Your next bill, 1667. Thank you, testifiers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members.
Senator Hoffman?
Yeah.
Anything you can do to move this along would be greatly appreciated, but I do not want to limit your passion and intellect on these issues.
I got you.
either.
This, all it does is it establishes a working group to look at going up to age 7 right now in Minnesota under early intervention services. This is just a clarification piece, and it makes it consistent with some other things that are operating within the conflicts of current federal law. That's all I'm going to give you.
And do you have the A3 amendment?
I got that. I do have an amendment, yes. Can you have somebody, Mr. Westenberg?
Senator May Quaid? Yep.
Yep, that's it.
All those in favor of the A3 amendment, say aye. Aye. All those opposed? The A3 amendment carries. You have two testifiers, and if the two testifiers could be as succinct and brief as possible. Don't go. I mean, whatever you wish, Senator Hoffman.
Well, you told me you didn't want, I mean, if I stay here, I'm going to
Well, you have to do your closing remarks, of course.
Okay, you got it, so go ahead.
Thank you. Chair Swedzinski, members of the Education Policy Committee. Again, I'm Heidi Nissler. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Specialized Services for St. Paul, here on behalf of MACE, the Minnesota Administrators for Special Education, in support of this bill to form a work group. This bill does not propose any changes in statute regarding eligibility for students under the developmental delay category, but what this bill would do is establish a work group consisting of parent advocates, special education leaders, teachers from Education Minnesota, school psychologists, to explore the implications of a potential change in statute to align with federal regulations. The importance of this is that Minnesota eligibility for DD ends at age 7, whereas the federal requirement would be age 9. So as a result, we have children who are 7 and 8 years old who could potentially be eligible for services under the federal law, but in the state of Minnesota are not eligible. IEP teams would still be able to identify a student with a specific disability, such as autism spectrum disorder or specific learning disability, but for students who may not meet eligibility in those areas, it could, what this work group would do is examine the implications if there were a change to align with federal regulations. And again, the intent is just to form a work group, not to change what the statute says right now.
Thank you. Identify yourself for the record and begin your testimony.
Thank you so much, Chair Swedzinski. My name is Maren Christensen Hofer. I'm a parent of a child with a disability, and I work for the Multicultural Autism Action Network. I'm going to try to be really brief here. We have no objection to this bill. We have no objection to forming a work group. We just want to draw your attention to the sometimes problematic history about how educational labels have been used as a tool for racial segregation in the past. And specifically, we are aware of many situations where you've seen children of color being directed towards an EBD label, Caucasian children directing for an ASD label, and school districts trying to get around that by not using either of those labels and pushing people towards a DD label instead. So we would just like to create some awareness around the history, and we hope that that is taken into consideration by the members of the work group if this goes forward. Thank you.
You'll do that. Yeah, we're good. Thank you.
Thank you for your succinctness, both testifiers. We appreciate that. Senator Hoffman, members, questions? Your bill is going
means I get to
to
answer if
state
there's
and local government. Senator Hoffman?
Floor with it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Closing comments?
Good bill, Mr. Chair. Pass it. Thank you.
Okay, we're sending it to state and local government. So, okay, Senator.
You gotta make a motion. Don't you?
Senator Abler moves the bill. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, thank you, Senator Abler.
I missed this committee, Steve.
Feelings mutual. Senator Farnsworth. Whenever you're ready, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do want to point out that I don't believe Mr. Alaspa will be testifying. They were having a hard time finding a sub for him today, so he wasn't able to step out to do this. And before I move on, Mr. Chair, I do have the A1 amendment, and what this amendment does, we discovered actually when we were reading some of the letters, the letter that Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid had submitted, we realized that my bill was slightly out of compliance with the federal government, so the A1 amendment will make sure that we are still in compliance with federal rules.
Senator Abler, move the A1 amendment. All those in favor of the author's amendment say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. Senate File 2078 is intended to make a dent in reducing paperwork for our special education teachers. Now, I may be biased as a special education teacher, but I do believe that special education teachers have the hardest job in all of education. On an average day, a special ed teacher has the duties similar to a regular education teacher, including preparing lesson plans, teaching students throughout the day. However, unlike their peers in the regular education world, they can't just develop one lesson to present to a class that day. They have to develop multiple lessons, have multiple materials, because their students have a variety of levels as far as learning. In addition to that, they have to develop yearly IEPs for each of the students on their caseload, and this can range from 10 to 20 pages or sometimes longer, depending on the severity of the disability. And they can't just mail that IEP to the parents. They have to have an in-person meeting, work through the IEP with the parents, and this is for every student on their caseload. There are a lot of other duties like progress reports that they do 4 times a year, in addition to any grade reports that they would do, writing functional behavior assessments and more. If I were to list all of the duties of a special education teacher, we would run out of time today. So what does my bill do? We got, Mr. Chair, I know that you're on the Ed Finance Committee and a number of other members. We got this report earlier in the year from, I can't remember, one of the Ed Finance, I think the CA and Ed Finance, that looked at what are we doing in the state that is an addition or exceeds federal regulations. And so I went through this report, it's like 40-some pages, and looked at what are some things that we can do that wouldn't diminish the quality of the education that students receive, but would be a meaningful paperwork reduction. And so the 2 things that I came up with, the first thing is changing the transition requirement in the state of Minnesota. So in Minnesota, we have to begin transition planning for students either by the age of 14 or 9th grade. And the federal rule says that you start that at age 16. And I think there was a time that probably was important to start it earlier, but that was before we had a lot of the career requirements in our grad standards. It was before we had the personal finance class that we passed last year. So now all students in Minnesota are getting a lot of the things that these younger students in special education were getting. And so I think that we can make this change. And I also want to point out that we're not mandating the change. This is something that the parents would have to agree to. So if the parents say, nope, I still want to have transition services for my 14-year-old, then they would still do that. And the second part, the second change is to remove the requirement for teachers to include short-term objectives in an IEP. Right now in Minnesota, you have to have a goal, and then you have to have at least 2 short-term objectives that sort of define that goal. But I would argue that if you had a well-defined goal, if we made sure the teachers were writing good goals, we wouldn't need to have them write those short-term objectives. And the amendment, again, it cleared up the issue with federal law because if students take the alternate assessment instead of the MCAs, then they would still have to have the short-term objectives. And so that's why we passed this amendment. So with all of that, we have testifiers here, and they probably can explain this better than I can, and I took a lot longer than I planned. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator, and if you don't mind, we'll take the virtual testimony last so we can get to the people that are here live.
Yes,
So
sure.
I'll bump Lenora Jensen to the end, if that's cool.
I think she's just driving down to the hockey tournament, so she's probably on the road, so hopefully she's okay with that.
Okay. Well, okay, we'll go in order. I was just trying to simplify things. Lenora Jensen, begin if you're available, and drive safe, please.
Maybe not.
Well, we'll get back to her. Okay. Begin your testimony.
Are you able to hear me?
Oh, there she is. All right, we're ready. Ms. Jensen. We'll come back to her unless she all of a sudden jumps in again. identify yourself and make sure you sign in on the sign-up sheet up there and begin your testimony. Thank you for coming in.
Yes, Chairman Swedzinski, members of the committee, my name is Nicole Woodward. I'm the Executive Director of the St. Croix River Education District here on behalf of MACE, the Minnesota Administrators for Special Education. I'm here to testify in support of Senate File 2078, which, if approved, the two proposed changes would put Minnesota special ed requirements in closer alignment with federal law and provide impactful paperwork relief to special ed teachers across the state. As a special ed administrator, I have a deep appreciation for special ed paperwork. A student's IEP is a critically important tool that serves as a personalized roadmap to guide teams in meeting the needs of the student, provides a framework for collaboration with school teams and families, and ensures legal protections for students, anchoring us all in accountability. You've heard for years about the burden special ed paperwork places on teachers. I think it's very important that you understand our true objective is to do what is best for students. Less paperwork time means more time spent on instruction and support. Federal law only requires benchmarks and objectives for students who take an alternate assessment, which is around 1% of a school district's population. We're actually capped at 1% in identifying students who take that assessment, so that's just important context. Conversely, Minnesota requires those objectives be determined for all students with IEPs. When we ask to eliminate the requirement that all IEP goals include benchmarks or objectives, we are not seeking to take anything away from students. Instead, we're looking for a pathway to provide special educators with bandwidth to focus on the elements of the IEP that have the greatest impact on success, to reduce redundancies and to amplify more meaningful components of the IEP, annual measurable goals, and regular progress reporting. A well-written goal is measurable, meaningful, and provides a team everything they need to make sure a student has an IEP that's reasonably calculated, opportunities to make progress in light of their unique circumstances, and a chance to meet challenging objectives. I'd like to share with you a couple of de-identified IEP goal examples from my system. Note the specificity in the time frame, the skills, and the criterion for success being targeted. By March 2026, when presented with unrehearsed 5th grade level passages, Cindy will increase her rate of reading orally from 84 words correct per minute to 121 words correct per minute, with at least 95% accuracy for 2 consecutive data points, as measured weekly by special ed staff using oral reading fluency probes. Another example, by March 2026, when presented with a hand washing task, Adam will increase his ability to complete a hand washing routine from currently obtaining 8 out of 24 points on the hand washing rubric to obtaining 16 out of 24 points for 2 consecutive data points as measured weekly by special ed staff using the hand washing rubric. As I hope you can see, these IEP goals spell out exactly how progress toward meeting this goal will be measured, including the data collection methods that will be used. At SCRED and the 6 member districts we serve, we have local systems and procedures in place in which special ed teachers are expected to graph IEP goal data. We can look at a student's graph at any time to determine if they are making adequate progress toward their goal, and that data is then used to inform regular progress reports that are sent to parents. Having to write 2 short-term objectives does not provide any additional meaningful impact on our ability to measure or report progress. And while I'm in no way suggesting that graphing IEP goals should be required, the system took many years to implement and requires a great deal of resource allocation to do so with fidelity. What I am suggesting is that districts be provided with trust and local flexibility, as they have multiple methods to collect data, review that data, and report that data to parents. Further, districts are required to report progress to parents as often as progress is reported in general ed. These reports have to include a statement about the adequacy of a student's progress, and they need to contain quantifiable data that support that statement. Nothing in this bill would change that requirement or decrease the frequency or quality of progress reports given to parents. Briefly, when it comes to transition planning, the current requirement to complete transition evaluations in 9th grade does strain our system. The requirement results in every 9th grade student needing a comprehensive re-evaluation. To mitigate the significant workload increase this places on our case managers who serve 9th grade students, we, in our system, expect transition evaluations to be included in 3-year re-evals for 7th, 8th, and 9th grade students, whichever comes first. Multiple other systems do the same thing. While this equalizes the workload, transition planning for 7th and 8th graders often feels premature and confusing to families. Further, our middle schools aren't designed to provide transition services, such as the development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives. Our high schools are way better equipped for those efforts. By allowing an option with parental consent to delay transition planning up to the age of 16 in alignment with federal law, school teams are better able to utilize the natural timing of reevaluations to engage in transition planning and more equipped to provide then those required transition services. In addition, students and families are better prepared to think seriously about plans after high school and what a young person with a disability might need to achieve success in post-secondary education and training, employment, and independent living. To be clear, in seeking these changes and flexibilities, we are in no way seeking to remove any protections, services, or supports for students. Instead, we're striving to align more closely with federal requirements, enhance educator efficiency, foster collaboration with families, and promote practices that have a significant and positive impact on student achievement and success in school. I really appreciate your careful consideration of Senate File 2078 and urge you to vote in favor of this bill.
Thank you for your testimony. We have 3 more testifiers, and that does not include Ms. Jensen if we get her back. So an eye on the clock, final testifiers would be greatly appreciated by the committee.
Yes, thank you, Chair Swedzinski. Thank you, Senator, for bringing this bill. I remember talking to you about it in your office a couple of years ago, and it's exciting that it's here. I won't get into the technicalities because my colleague from Mace just did a fascinating job of explaining all of the ways that this would help my members and your members as well. We are in complete agreement on that. The things that I would like to address is the concerns, the real concerns from the disability advocacy community. We, my members, think special education paperwork is very, very, very important. It's the family's window into what's going on at school. And we are in no way trying to shorten that window. What we're trying to do is increase direct contact time so that my members who are trained to work with these students have the ability to teach them. And so much paperwork is getting in the way. Now, you've heard ad nauseum that Minnesota has requirements that go above and beyond the federal requirement. And I have often asked my SPED teachers, what if we ran a bill that just got rid of all of them? Would that do it? Would that fix it for you? And they say absolutely not. Because there are many of the Minnesota requirements that they like and they think are important. But there are some that have outlived their utility, and this may be one of them. One of your other testifiers did note that Education Minnesota hosted a symposium about a year ago in which we invited all SPED stakeholders to come talk about paperwork reform. That symposium led to the change you made last year on DAPE. And we are more than happy to host that same symposium again with Mace and with all the disability advocates if this is something that we can really get done. Because I'm telling you right now, a reduction in paperwork is an easy fix to really boost morale for special education teachers across the state. And thank you, Senator, for being brave enough to bring this bill forward.
Thank you for your testimony. Ms. Christensen, and then Ms. Areola.
Thank you so much, Chair Swedzinski and committee members. Again, my name is Maren Christensen Hofer. I'm a parent of a child with this disability, and I also serve as the executive director for the Multicultural Autism Action Network. Senator Farnsworth, thank you for bringing forward this bill because it brings an opportunity to have a really important conversation about short-term objectives. We believe that this is absolutely not in the best interest of students and families because those short-term objectives serve a very important role in improving the transparency of what is an incredibly opaque and difficult to navigate process. Specifically, those short-term objectives often describe how an IEP goal is to be met. It describes the steps that we're going to take to get a student from point A to point B. Secondly, they provide an opportunity to check in. We heard earlier in Ms. Nisler's great presentation that IEP meetings are required once a year, and often those short-term objectives will give us benchmarks throughout the year to say, are we on track? Are we not on track? Do we need to check in or adjust? If we eliminate the short-term objectives, we're getting rid of those check-ins. Finally, the short-term objectives are often written in a much more transparent and user-friendly way. In my written testimony, you will find an example of a goal, and we heard from earlier testifiers examples of goals too. And I don't know, if you were able to make sense out of them, but they're often very complicated and kind of difficult to navigate. And I want you to think about how well you would be able to make sense out of those goals if you were a person who spoke English as a second language, or if you were a person perhaps who had dyslexia yourself. Would you be able to participate in your child's education if you can't really even understand what the goal is trying to say? We absolutely agree that IEP paperwork is cumbersome, it's unwieldy, and it is accessible, and it really does not serve the purposes of parents or educators or students very well. But the answer here is not to roll back protections for families. In the consortium that we heard about from admin, that was a wonderful opportunity to bring stakeholders together. But again, there was consensus around the fact that there is so much in an IEP that goes far above and beyond the state and the federal requirements, and that's really should be the focus of our attention. We heard about the graphs, we heard about the charts, we heard about the state standards. None of those things are required in state and federal law, but yet they add to the IEP paperwork and make it less transparent rather than more, and add considerably to the burdens of special education teachers. We want to have that conversation, and we will gladly collaborate on that work, but rolling back short-term objectives is not the way to do this. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ariola.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Megan Ariola, and I serve as the Legislative Policy Manager for the Minnesota Department of Education. Thank you for the opportunity to provide MDE's comments and concerns regarding SF 2078 before the committee today. First of all, I want to just say MDE recognizes the burden that educators face when we talk about special education paperwork. MDE has supported and implemented several paperwork reduction initiatives in recent years, including reducing the size and scope of the total special education system documentation, reducing the special education program monitoring burden to focus only on annual performance indicators, and allowing the developmental physical education assessment and functional behavioral assessments to be conducted as standalone assessments as opposed to requiring full reevaluation. However, we would like to just give some caution to the committee regarding the proposal to eliminate the benchmarks and short-term objectives as part of annual goals in IEPs. Having benchmarks and short-term objectives are valuable tools and information points for parents and students to have differentiated strategies, supports, and interventions in a timely and iterative process. IDEA sets basic requirements for all IEPs, which does include a statement of measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals that are designed to meet the student's educational needs. But we know that for children with disabilities who take alternative assessments aligned to alternate academic achievement standards, a description of these benchmarks and these short-term objectives is crucial to ensure that these unique needs are met. The Minnesota rule, which this proposal seeks to amend, largely does mirror the requirements set by federal laws to the states, with the addition, as mentioned, of benchmarks or short-term objectives to be included within the statement of measurable goals for all students' IEPs, not just those who take alternate assessments. And MDE supports retaining those benchmarks and short-term objectives for all student IEPs. It's important to note that we do appreciate the amendment today from Senator Farnsworth to address this requirement in legislation regarding the rulemaking process, and we look forward to following the language's evolution, and we'll always be happy to provide some technical feedback and some context for the committee when asked. Thank you all again for the opportunity to provide some comments today.
Members, Senator Kunish.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Kruin, you received a list of all those.
Senator Farnsworth.
Excuse me, Farnsworth. I know. You received a list of perhaps cumbersome requirements and things that special ed teachers have to do. Why did you choose these two, the benchmarks and the short-term objectives?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Kunish. And I do believe that we still have a testifier online. She texted me that she's still there, so hopefully we can get back to her. So so I went through this whole thing. A lot of the things in here I just don't understand, and I don't think would help like regular special education teachers. And so what I did is I talked to special education teachers in my district and said, you know, of the things that we know are not required at the federal level, what would make the biggest impact? And especially for the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade case managers, they said the transition part would be a big deal. The kids are already getting that through the regular education classes, and then the short-term objectives. And I want to point out, because one of the testifiers referenced a goal in the document. This is the MANN, and you have this in your packet. This is a terrible goal, which is why I said if we do good goals, which the goals that the first testifier talked about, if we do good quality goals like that, we don't need the objectives. Yeah, I mean, if we allow teachers to get away with this, then maybe we, you know, would have to keep the objectives. But if teachers are doing really good goals, measurable goals, then we don't. So it was in consultation with special education teachers that I know and some of the outside groups, just to say, okay, can we save 10 or 15 minutes per IEP? I mean, if you have 25 kids on your caseload, 10 or 15 minutes per IEP is going to save a lot of time. So, so that's, sorry, a long answer to the question.
Just one follow-up.
Sir, yes.
I know in regular education, there are benchmarks and short-term objectives that teachers have to specify in their lesson plans and their goal setting and that sort of thing. Would it also then make sense that we would remove that expectation as well for general ed?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Kunish. If it didn't add to the education of the student, then maybe that is something that we could talk about. You know, it's been a long time since I was a regular education teacher and actually had to do lesson plans. But I think that's apples to oranges. The actual objectives that somebody wants to achieve during a lesson on any given day is a little bit different than the objectives that would be written in an IEP, because basically the objectives that are written in an IEP are a shortened version of the goal. So if, for instance, if the goal is that a student is going to read at a fluency of 80 words per minute, then one of the objectives might be by December, they'll read at 60 words per minute. But it doesn't change the goal. The goal is still the goal. The goal is still 80 words per minute. Whereas an objective and a benchmark in a daily lesson plan specifically spells out this is what the students are supposed to learn on that day.
And just a comment. I guess I would be concerned that, like, if I were a parent of a special ed student and went to my teacher and said, you know, how's little Joey doing? You know, he's supposed to read, 80 words per minute by this time. Can you tell me what it is? And you might say, well, we've been practicing it, we've been working on it, but if you don't have those benchmarks or those short-term objectives where you actually put action behind those objectives, how do you know you're reaching that you're going to reach that objective by the time you've reached that, the goal expectation?
Mr. Chair, Senator Kunish, that's a good question, and I'm glad you asked it, because I forgot in my initial presentation, I forgot to actually talk about this. This doesn't take away progress reporting. So teachers will still be doing progress reporting 4 times per year. So as an example, when I still had a caseload, I had a binder for all of my students, and it had all of the goals, and it had, everything they were working on. And so 4 times per year, I would, depending on what the goal was, if it was a reading fluency goal, I would sit down and I would do a reading fluency test, and then I would do the progress report. So parents would still be getting progress reports. That would still be measured. It has to be measured whether there's short-term objectives or not. This doesn't take that progress reporting component out.
Thank you, I'm done.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I hope we can table the bill and so that we can have a longer time to discuss it, because I think we've obviously gotten into a meaty conversation, and I think it's worth having. And I don't want to have it on a compressed timeline just to, match a schedule. But I think, I have concerns, and I think it's more right now that we're rushing through something. But when I read your bill, Senator Farnsworth, and even after reading the amendment, I went to the section 300.320 subpart A, clause 2. And, I'm reading that for children with disabilities who take alternate assessments aligned to alternate academic achievement standards, a description of benchmarks or short-term objectives, that's what it's in IDEA. But to my understanding, we don't have alternate academic achievement standards in Minnesota. We just have standards, and then it is up to whatever kind of education a student is getting to meet those standards. And so I don't know if your amendment actually does, I don't know if it meets the federal requirements because you're missing part of the definition that they have there. But the way that it is now with the amount of concern that I'm hearing and this big of a change, I'm not there yet, but I really want us to keep having the conversation because I'm not opposed to figuring out how we can do this better, but it's, I would love us to see that report, have a presentation on it, hear a lot of testimony, see some IEPs, I'm a visual learner, and see what it could look like, because we're diving into just like a really big change in the last 20 minutes of a committee, and I don't think that we are gonna give it its due if we don't do it more.
We have a special ed shortage in Minnesota, and I think one of the reasons is the amount of paperwork that they have to do, and that's why I'm a co-author of this bill, because of the noble attempt on your behalf to try to figure that problem out. And I'm not willing to give up on trying to help special ed teachers with the amount of work they have to do, because no special ed teacher ever went into special education thinking, wow, I love paperwork. They go into special education because they love kids, and whatever we can do. And so I'm going to take Senator May Quaid's advice and lay this over, and over the coming couple weeks, let's work together with the stakeholders and try to figure this thing out. So that's my advice to you, Senator Farnsworth, as the chair. So if you have anything to add to what I just said, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Chair, I'm willing to work on this because I think this is important. If the amendment doesn't do what we intended it to do, then we need to work on that. So yeah, I think we certainly could keep working on it. I do hope, I don't know if my testifier is still on there, but she's, I think, been hanging on. So when it comes time for final statements, maybe I'll just allow her testimony to be my final statement, if that
We're
works.
there.
Okay. So, Lenora, if you're there.
I am here. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. And if you could try to the best of your ability, and I don't mean to rush you, but we are over, so, but we want to hear from you.
I have a very short statement. I apologize for the tech issues earlier. Thank you, Chair and committee members, for giving me this time to speak in support of Senate File 2078. My name is Lenora Jensen, and I am a high school special education teacher. I have been a special educator for over 3 decades, and in that time, I have seen many changes in due process paperwork requirements. I'm also a special education parent. When I began teaching in special education, an IEP was handwritten and about 2 to 3 pages long. Now my IEPs are at least 12 to 15 pages, and I am fortunate to only have 17 students on my caseload. To meet these paperwork requirements and deadlines, I must constantly take time away from my students and family to work on paperwork, which is impossible to complete within my contract hours. I firmly believe that special educators should be spending our time creating and delivering the high quality, individualized instruction our students need and deserve. Eliminating the short-term objectives requirement would give special educators additional time to work with the students. When I complete progress reporting 4 times per year, the reports are based on progress towards the goal, not the objectives. When I dreamed of becoming a teacher, I envisioned fostering a love of learning, not an overload of paperwork which takes me away from my students. Please free up a little bit of our precious time by supporting Senate File number 2078. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jensen. Was that your final comment too?
As promised, yes, Mr. Chair.
So we're going to take this bill for possible, laying it over for possible inclusion in the omnibus bill, but you and I will have further conversations with the stakeholders. So, okay, thank you, Senator and testifiers. Our next meeting is going to be March 10th. It's a work in progress. Keep an eye open for details on what we're going to be talking about that. And with that said, drive safe home, everybody. We're adjourned.